Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a cautionary tale that explores the consequences of scientific pursuit without concern for morality or what we might call the humanities. The story follows Victor Frankenstein, the prototypical mad scientist who, out of a lust for glory and power, decides to play God and create a life form out of dead body parts. When he eventually succeeds, he creates a new life form that he quickly abandons, leaving the creature to fend for itself as it becomes sentient and tries to interact with the world. We've likely encountered Frankenstein's monster out in the wilds of popular culture. With his green skin and painful comedic groans, few creatures have been so wildly misrepresented in movies and media. While it is true the creature is a murderer, he is also a wretched and miserable creature, abandoned by his father at birth, only to have his heart continually broken by an increasingly cruel world. He is, in fact, thrown into an absolute isolation, due only to the circumstances of his creation, which are far beyond his control. After attempting, in earnest, to live a beautiful, moral life, the monster ultimately chooses to be evil, a murderer, a wretched monster, for truly it is the only choice he has. While written several years ago by a young woman, this tale has served as one of the primary influences of both science fiction and Gothic literature. Not only did the tale introduce us to the figure of the mad scientist, that is Victor Frankenstein, it was also arguably one of the first texts that dealt heavily with post-humanism, the idea that humanity is not the apex of evolution. In the same way, creatures like aliens, artificial intelligences, robots, and other sci-fi monsters terrify us with their supernatural, superhuman abilities. Frankenstein's monster is a creation that supersedes the powers of a normal, mortal man. He is incredibly strong, incredibly intelligent, and incredibly focused on making a world in which he can belong, even, and especially, if it means destroying the world we live in. Frankenstein opens with a series of letters from one Robert Walton. It's what we call a narrative frame or a frame story. A frame story is set up as a story within a story. Not as crazy as something like Inception. Usually, the first story is set in reality, and the story that is being told is somehow fantastic. The frame helps us believe the fantasy. And it's a common technique in science fiction, fantasy, and love stories. Take a look at Tim Burton's Big Fish, or Rose's recollection in Titanic, or the love story in The Notebook. All use a frame in order to help us readers suspend our disbelief and enter the story world. The goal of the frame is both to usher readers slowly into the fantastic world, but also to give us the tools necessary to understand the major themes and characters in the work. For instance, in the opening of Frankenstein, we are introduced to Robert Walton, the captain of a ship heading towards the North Pole. Self-educated in both science and letters, Walton has been driven by curiosity and passion to seek the unknown areas of the North Pole, where he might discover, quote, the wondrous power which attracts the needle, that is the cause of magnetic north, and potentially view 1,000 celestial observations. He is not so much driven by any humanitarian effort, but to, quote, satiate his ardent curiosity with the sight of a world never before visited, and with the thought of going where no one has gone before. As we work our way through these letters, we learn that we are very much situated in the real world. This is not some parallel fantasy world we might experience in more contemporary sci-fi, but this is our world. We have the same philosophers, the same history. We can go visit Geneva whenever we want. In addition to being a way to access the world of Frankenstein, Walton also serves as a way for us to access Victor through a more relatable but similar character. Walton is not the mad scientist that Victor is, but is a relatable character who has very human desires and is much more likable than Victor. He is kind, and while he is driven entirely by his curiosity, his endeavor doesn't give us as much ick as Victor does. Walton simply wants to see things no one has seen before. And, as we know through his letters, he could just really use a really good friend. It is, more importantly, through Walton's eyes and letters that we learn of the existence of Frankenstein's monster, as he sees the monster traverse the Arctic on a dog sled right before he meets Victor. This gives the novel a sense of reality and weight. This isn't meant to be read as some mere what-if situation, but rather as a tangible, possible reality of a madman pursuing the limits of science too far. Throughout the letters, we are also introduced personally to Victor, and the two have a very quick relationship, and they grow to be friends very quickly. Victor is pursuing the same thing that Walton is, right? He's trying to get to the North Pole, but he doesn't even care that he's going to the North Pole. His goal is to capture the monster, right? There's tons of parallels. They're on the same journey. They're going to the same destination, though they have different reasons for doing so. And in a way, the North Pole is almost like beneath Victor. That's not his goal of what he's trying to do. That's Walton's dream. After he agrees to tell Walton his story, we are thrown into the main narrative of Frankenstein. In the first 3 chapters, we are introduced to the early life and formative moments of Victor Frankenstein as he sees them. We learn that he's a child of extreme wealth and privilege. No surprise. He's born to a wealthy man and his young wife with a heart of gold. His father and mother, being wealthy, leave him wanting for nothing. He says, "My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed upon them by heaven, whom to bring up good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties to me." With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life, added to this active spirit of tenderness that animated both, it may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received lessons of patience, of charity, and of self-control, I was so guided by a silken cord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. As we'll see later when we meet the monster, everything Victor enjoyed as a child, everything he knew to be good, and every responsibility that he learned from his father about what a father ought to do, is something he will later deny the monster, much to the monster's protest. From warmth and education to even securing Victor a bride, right? He literally is just given this beautiful bride, and she's, of course, automatically in love with him. Victor has been given everything in life, and yet it does not seem to be enough for him. In Chapter 2, we are introduced to his fascination with natural philosophy, what we would call today as the broad STEM field or science. And this is, in my estimate, kind of the root of his inability to account for his own actions. Throughout this section, we see both that his pursuits are geared towards glory and power, but also that, despite his brilliant scientific mind, his moral, humanistic mind, or what we might call his heart, is woefully underdeveloped. Constantly he blames the fates, or what we might call in philosophy the view of hard determinism. A philosophy that claims everything that happens in the world happens necessarily, and rejects the idea of free will. And we see this in his language all throughout this section and throughout the book. Chance, Victor says, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent, swayed over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door. He says this right after his mother passes away. Ironically, this overinflated ego and underdeveloped sense of morality leads him to wildly misunderstand the world and his own responsibility. He seems to view the inevitability of death, one of the most natural things of anyone's life, as an evil. This allows him to disavow the actual practicality of modern natural philosophy, as he calls it, which was doing things that actually helped humanity at large. That is, his aims, even from a young age, are to possess power and glory for purely personal reasons. He doesn't have enough, despite growing up incredibly privileged and wealthy, despite having a beautiful bride handed to him. While he might, if he was acquainted with the figure, fancy himself a regular Isaac Newton, and he certainly did have an intellectual prowess in the books, he reminds me a little bit more of Elon Musk.